we are ready to start back up again. Hello, hello, in the room and online. My name is Dr. Holly Castleter, and I will be chairing this very first exciting panel. Reminder to people online, there is a Q&A function in the chat. So as our wonderful panelists are presenting, type your question in. And then those of you live in person with us, write your questions down, and we'll do questions for both panelists at the end. Yeah? All right, our first presenter for this panel is Dr. Katharine Kavanagh. And Katharine is a circus writer and researcher who is interested in the communicative space between practitioners, publics, and institutions. She founded the online platform, the Circus Diaries, in 2013, and teaches courses in circus review and analysis, both at circus schools and independently. She is also a teaching associate at Cardiff University, working across the schools of journalism, media, and culture, and the School of English, Communication, and Philosophy. She is driven to raise the profile of 21st century circus wherever possible. And without further ado, Katharine, take it away.
Great, thank you, Holly, and thank you, Tom, as well, for inviting me and for having this exciting event. Yeah, I'm here in Cardiff today and it's been snowing. So although I'm very sad not to be with you in London, I'm glad that I didn't miss the snow flurries. Disclaimer before I start, as Holly's sort of explained there, my research background is in circus. So my encounters with metamodernism come almost more from a place of fandom than formal exhaustive scholarship. So that's to say, my observations today are by no means comprehensive, but are an introduction to one particular meeting point of metamodern theory and circus practice that's caught my attention and sparked my interest. Around this time last year, I was in Sweden giving a very similarly themed talk, but as part of a circus festival. And what I was doing there was largely introducing concepts of metamodernism to a circus savvy audience. But today I feel like I probably need to take the opposite tack and begin with an introduction to the 21st century circus studies context. My suspicion is that most people in a Western society have a mental image, something like this, when the idea of circus is mentioned. And I'm trying to press, there we go, there's my button. So this image is from ChatGPT. And we all know that AI is not reliable in every context, but it does a really good job of illustrating the dominant online representations of a topic. And I think for most people, in lieu of substantial first-hand experience of circus, it's these representations that form most people's conceptions of what it means. We look at this image and we can see it's based very heavily on mid-20th century types of circus performance, offering a sort of nostalgic perspective. And connected to that is a link to childhood that we see, again, if we look at sort of search results. If I put circus into a search engine, we get these dominant red and white striped tents, big animals, kind of iconic clown or ringmaster personas, but no real performer identity. And then these animations that link closely to this kind of childhood nostalgia. But in real life, what I have seen more often in the last 15 years that I have been studying circus are things more like this. So there are very different aesthetics, different types of venue, different intended audiences. There's ensemble shows, single discipline shows, solo shows. We've got people just working in one form, so just tight wire, just acrobatics, or novel equipment that has been designed uniquely by the artist. Interdisciplinary collaborations with dance or theatre makers or visual artists. And that's not to say that the variety of circus shown on the previous slide no longer exists, but they coexist as part of a much larger picture than mainstream representation would acknowledge. And it's also important to remember that much of this variety, so artists working solo in various venue types and in collaboration with other art forms, is not new either, but is largely overlooked in the dominance of those red and white striped elephant images. And sadly, this is also somewhat true in conventional circus scholarship. So I'll give you a very quick rundown of how circus is usually classified. We normally see this sort of tripartite distinction of traditional circus, new circus or cirque nouveau, and contemporary circus, where the label traditional correlates highly with the tented shows with no overt narrative, often exemplified by the sorts of images we saw on the first slide and associated with modernity. For new circus, the poster child would be Cirque du Soleil, producing vivid aesthetic worlds that communicate a degree of storytelling illustrated with or through circus technique. This form arose from the late 1960s and the early 70s with the politics of the time, and came very much from theatre makers and artists wanting to draw on and bring in the populist qualities of circus, rather than from circus artists and practitioners themselves. Contemporary circus then does emerge more from circus practitioners, particularly from those who are self-taught and circus school trained, rather than the familiar or lineages or families that had come beforehand. And it can be seen in some ways as aligning with post-dramatic theatre. It emerged in the 1990s, but it removes the focus on tricks and their inherent drama and on overt physical mastery to explore instead alternate communicative and artistic potentials of technical circus practice. Now, unfortunately, there is no widely accepted definition of how this distinction is made. They're fuzzy, amorphous terms, and they rely heavily on personal interpretation, as noted in a European Commission report from 2020. So there are problems with the historiography of it. For example, condensing 200 or more years of innovation and development into the one label traditional, particularly effacing any non-Western forms and conceptions. And then the other side of that, evolving expectations of what the cutting edge of contemporary might mean, no longer fit past examples of the label. The first year I taught circus students at the National Centre for Circus Arts in London, I was introducing them to a kind of pivotal production called Traces. Some of you may have known it, the Canadian circus company. And I got the comment, it's bad contemporary circus. And what they really meant is that their conception of what is contemporary had moved on in the 15 years, but it highlights one of the problems with this labelling. And there's also problems when you try and relate the labels to the form or the content of the work rather than the historical period. A semiotic scholar, Franziska Trapp, has proposed a framework for reassigning those labels based on the communicative structure of circus shows. But this then clashes with the more widely understood socio-historical version. And I think the bottom line is that circus now is best characterised as diverse, rhizomatic, manifold, and complex. And part of this complexity, and where I'm going to be focusing my attention for the rest of this talk, is a relatively recent scholarly recognition that circus, as it's understood today, contains a number of inherent contradictions or paradoxes. So I shall show you there. We talk about in Circus Studies technique versus artistry, the physical development and training versus the communicative potential of a work and where they clash. We talk about authenticity versus representation. We talk about skill versus risk, art versus entertainment, colonialisms and capitalism versus freedoms and autonomy. And that's not to say these contradictions have not existed in previous eras or manifestations of circus practice, but we're currently living in an era where we recognise them as such. And I recognise Greg's point earlier that not every binary is in itself metamodern, but this metamodern structure of feeling is that which allows us to see beyond, betwixt and between such binaries. When Raymond Williams introduced the idea of a structure of feeling as an identifying component of a cultural time and place, he described it as this felt sense of the quality of life at a particular place and time, a sense of the ways in which the particular activities combined into a way of thinking and living. So a structure of feeling is a unique perspective stemming from living in a particular cultural milieu. Looking at this slide, this fracturing into qualities of eternal, irreconcilable otherness, as presented here as oppositions, fits most easily within a structure of feeling associated with the postmodern paradigm, remaining paradoxical. A metamodern structure of feeling, though, allows us to recognise the coexistence of these seemingly contradictory qualities, characterised by an oscillation forwards and backwards and between the facets. So we've heard that a key element of metamodernism is its oscillation. Some theorists describe this as a pendulum swinging back and forth between the features of alternate worldviews. Some theorists complain that this makes it sound too regular, so prefer to talk about a needle bouncing about a dial. And some theorists talk more about braiding, where the features are woven together, but where different strands come into focus at different times. Instead of seeing a paradoxical existence of irreconcilable ideas, metamodernism allows us to embrace the notion that two things can exist in one place at the same time. It reminds me of quantum theory, which I'm no expert in, but this seems an apt philosophical extension of our growing scientific and technological understanding of the world, part of the lived experience that makes up the metamodern structure of feeling. And this perspective on circus analysis can be encompassed in the term both and thinking, where, like it says on the tin, you can entertain both one idea and another seemingly contradictory one at the same time. So to say a little bit more about this both and idea, as Greg alluded, there are different ways of understanding metamodernism, and two of the main ways of separating that would be between a socio-historical approach and an arts criticism approach. Within the arts criticism sphere, the term both neither is commonly seen, which is coined by Vermeulen and Van den Akker in their 2010 text Notes on Metamodernism, where they explain that the dynamic of metamodern epistemology and ontology is at once modern and postmodern, and neither of them. The term both and seems to have come from Leni Rachel Anderson's series of novels titled, if you'll excuse my non-existent Danish, Bad Og, which is translated as both and. It's a play on the earlier Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard's Either Or, which suggested that humans must choose either a life of decadence and aesthetics or one of ethics and rationale, but which also ultimately hints at a third mode of transcendence. As of last year, Anderson renamed her socio-historical theorising as polymodernity rather than metamodernity, as perhaps a clearer term for understanding the integration of multiple cultural codes that form the basis of her approach. But the idea of both and thinking has carried through into metamodern theory more widely, and it highlights that seemingly oppositional positions can be occupied within one understanding, and allows for the recognition of what Seth Abramson calls generative paradoxes. So while those binary opposites that I initially presented stimmy thoughtful development by putting up a wall separating the elements, the generative nature of a both and conceptualization opens up what previous cultural structures had us consider as simple black and white paradoxes, moving into more fruitful realms that we can unpack. So within Circus, this can be illustrated, for example, by Kate Holmes's recent theorising of skillful vulnerability, as the manner in which circus artists present themselves as vulnerable to physical risk through careful management of their technical mastery, in order to engage audiences in a fantasy of risk, whilst of course there is also some degree of real risk present alongside the illusion. Well, this then feeds into the co-present both and condition of authenticity and representation. So this gives us a way in to exploring how circus works in that audience performer interaction moment. it became really clear to me while writing this talk that 15 minutes is not a lot of time to introduce the volume of ideas nascent in a metamodern approach to circus. So I'm afraid I am going to just have to leave this here as a sort of taster only and trust that the Q&A gives space to flesh out any further indicators as required. But if you're interested in exploring some more avenues through which circus studies and metamodernism intersect, then I'd direct you to the online documentation of last year's symposium on the topic, which was a day of talks, performance and discussion in Cardiff. And that QR code and URL will take you to videos of the day, including wonderful keynote presentation from Dr. Tom Drayton here. I do have a slide of references too, but it's probably more valuable to leave this one showing for a moment for anyone who wants to scan the code or take down the URL. There's also a PDF document there of reflections that were produced after the event by participants and presenters. And finally, I just want to acknowledge that the metamodern structure of feeling and its associated theorising have opened a space where the recognition and analysis of effect, which has been such an essential part of the circus experience for so long, is at last legitimised within academic and cultural spheres. And for an old circus critic like me, this feels really exciting. It opens up a path for discussion of circus work in this way that feels valid and valuable and none too soon. So that move from cerebral to feelings-based effect that Greg was talking about, I think, is what's going to be key for the ongoing progression of circus studies in a metamodern era. And I will leave you with my references.
All right. Are there any questions on the chat to start off? No? Okay, chat, get a question going. Does anyone have any questions for Katharine?
Somebody's asked what my cat's name is in the break. She's called Jezebel. I have a good friend called Laura who was in the room there today in London, and she likes cats, so Jezebel was there for Laura, but I'm glad you appreciated her too.
I have a question. Can you give a bit more examples and dive a bit deeper into the skillful vulnerability? And I'm interested in how that affects audiences.
Yeah, so Kate Holmes's study looks particularly at a historical period of aerialists in the 1920s and 30s, but then she does kind of bring that forward and look at its relevance today, citing things like Pink's performance in pop music and things like that. But it's this idea that if a circus artist performs their pure technical ability to the kind of height of their technical ability, it's not that engaging to the audiences because it looks too safe. And so audiences are not as excited by somebody doing really well in their skill level, being at the really top of their game, as they are by that skill level being slightly underperformed with some choreographed elements that make it look more risky than it actually is. So while there is a degree of physical risk to any circus performance, the risk that is experienced by the performer and the discomfort that is experienced by the performer does not tend to align with the risk that is experienced or perceived by the audience members. And that's that like authenticity and representation, weird middle ground.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions at the back?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
So there's almost a performance to the authenticity. Is that fair to say? Because I mean, is there a performance in the vulnerability if the performer is aware that they feel safer than perhaps what the audience is perceiving?
Yeah, there is an element of that, but there's also an element of the performer is at more real risk perhaps than the audience perceive. So it's almost like they're at oppositional angles. So things like the rigging, which audience members rarely will consider, is the most common cause of aerial artist injury. Something will go wrong with the rigging, which is not their domain, not something they have control over. So that element of risk is present for the performer and is authentic, but is not necessarily perceived by the audience member, the audience member will think, oh, maybe they'll fall off their hoop, whereas the performer knows they're probably not going to fall off their hoop. So it's a mismatch.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Katharine. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.